there, let's not go back
Let's
there
not go
again.
there.
Right. But, so tonight, it was interesting, it was, I think, Wendy who said, last time, I mean, we're meeting one another quite shortly after the last meeting, but when I said poetry, she said, poetry? I don't read poetry. Ooh. And I said, bear with us, because this is really a narrative poem, it's a story. And when I met her in the hall, she said, I love this, it was a story. And so it demystified poetry. I think poetry, we were reading, actually I was reading a poet who sends me things in my email every day. I'm like getting overwhelmed. But he is a poet who happens to have Parkinson's, and I was using some of his poetry with a group of Parkinson's patients and care partners. And he writes a very complex form called a sestina, which, like sonnets, which, like, many poetic forms, are sort of rigid in their rhythm and their length and their form, and some poetry is extremely abstract, and you have to really, hunker down. But even one of the residents had wrote a piece yesterday. Actually, it was one of the medical students who had written a piece yesterday for our parallel chart sessions. And Dr. Brensilver and I, Jeff and I both said, she read it to us, but I saw it on her page, and we both said we could see you using more white space on the page. I mean, poetry can really be anything. It can be what you think of as prose. It's just, I mean, maybe a poet wouldn't say that, or a literary scholar perhaps wouldn't say that, but for our purposes and for my purposes as using literature as a vehicle for our discussion, poetry is the way I mean, these look like poems, but they read like a story. So what I'd like you to start with, if you wouldn't mind, is, instead of being evaluative about the experience or really just jumping right into the story itself, I'd like to hear a little bit from you about the experience of reading poetry and this particular kind of poetry. Just the experience of reading it, because I had a very particular experience in reading it. So I'd like if you talk a little bit about what it was like reading it. Do you understand my question? Yeah.
I liked reading it. It's sort of, I didn't get to finish it because I thought our meeting was next week. But anyway, the part that I read, I sort of felt like I was like floating along from poem to poem. Like it just sort of, yeah, it moved along. It was smoother than I expected. I expected to read one poem and sort of need to figure it out and go to the next poem, and it wasn't like that. It went very quickly.
Bob, did you want to say?
No, I was just thinking the same thing, that it read very smoothly. I enjoyed it. I didn't spend a lot of time looking at every word and every sentence trying to analyze it, and it made for a good story, and I thought it was interesting.
Yeah.
I actually took your advice and read it twice.
A few people did.
Yeah, it was a quick read, so it wasn't laborious to sit down and have to read it twice. I thought I was going to hate it because I've never really been interested in reading poetry, but I just thought it was so interesting that every page was, it made you want to turn the page to see what was going to happen next. So there was a little story on every page, a little, picture that you could kind of see. It wanted you to keep reading.
But it was all connected.
It was, yes, it was all
Almost
connected.
like you didn't want it to stop.
Yeah.
But what I found is I had to make sure I knew who was speaking, because it showed you on the top of the page who was speaking, and that was important before you read the poem, to know whose thoughts it were. But it was so down to earth and just ordinary life and so descriptive. I love some of the descriptions.
Yeah, I think I liked also that each poem was self-contained, but it still flowed with the rest. So I guess from a literary perspective, how she wrote it, I was very impressed because each was its own little story, but you definitely needed the rest. And I think that's what made me keep going, well, what is she going to do now, and what's going to happen with this job now? That's what I liked the most.
It was nothing like what I expected at all. I really enjoyed it a lot. I thought it was very sad. The timeline, I kept going back to the timeline in the beginning as to, who was who and their relationship. And the glossary was very helpful, too. And like Gail said, I really liked it because each page was a story. And it was simple to read and all connected, and it was very interesting, and I'm very curious to know if it was a true story.
Well, she'll be here soon. I'd like to tell you some of that.
There's book two. 'Cause I would have liked, maybe it was just me, I would have liked to know, maybe have one final poem like 10 years down the road and have Faye. Yeah, and like, what happened to
Whatever
her?
happened to Faye?
Yeah, even just
What happened
Faye.
to all of them?
Everyone.
Maybe just a page even of, by the way, this is what happened, because it's,
And not so,
Yeah.
for me, it was not so much what happened to like the parents, but like more just Faye, because this seemed to be more Faye's story than everyone else's story, and I just kind of like, what happened to her?
I think
Type of
we'll
thing.
be able to find that out. I think we'll be able to
Someone
find
in the book
it
had
out.
said that some of the characters were loosely based on the author's family.
Yeah.
So we'll be, she'll be here momentarily, and we'll be able to find out. Any other comments from people who haven't said anything yet?
I started reading it and I looked down and I was halfway through the book already. It just flowed so beautifully, and then it was getting late and I really needed to get to bed because I had to get up at 4 o'clock the next morning, and I could not wait to get back to it. I really couldn't. It was really good.
what I
I
really,
stayed awake till I finished it.
what I really liked is it did not remind me of high school. Because, remember, every poem we had to read in high school is very structured, and there was a rhyme and a rhythm and a iambic pentameter, and we had to write those little,
The accent.
the accent lines, and we had to map out the poem, and that really was totally dreadful, and I came away thinking that most poetry, the content is irrelevant, it's like a little game of getting the structure and the rhyme, and you could say anything stupid as long as it rhymes and has the right structure. So I became very anti-poetry. And then I got a chance when I was in college to read, really good poetry, much of which didn't have structure at all. It was blank verse or whatever. So when, I heard this was a book of poems, my initial reaction was back that, I'm going to be in like 10th grade again. And I was very negative. But what was pleasant is, as everybody said, it really was not bound by structure. She let her ideas structure her lines rather than letting the structure constrain her ideas, which I thought made it actually pleasant to read.
It will be curious to hear what she says, because as I was reading it, and I think that there is structure, but perhaps, again, I always remind you I'm not a literary scholar, so as I analyze that structure, it's not like I could go back to those high school or college classes and say, oh, this is a sonnet, or is this Stina, or
Right.
whatever different formulas there are. But it might be in the way she used the page. It might be the way she separated the stanzas or of the work. I found when I was reading it, the first and second time I read it, the first time I read it, I think I read it as individual poems, and that didn't really work for me, because I could forget from one sitting to the next sitting, where I was and the flow. So the next 2 times that I read it in one sitting, and it made all the difference. I really didn't read, the titles sort of faded out of my vision. I didn't care about the title of the poem. And I also found when I was reading, although I was not reading aloud, I heard my voice. I heard the speaker speaking. I mean, in my voice. It's not like I heard Morris or a masculine voice, but I heard the voice, not just read the line. So it was very alive for me. I could see this being performed. it was a very visual kind of experience. And it's too bad that Joan just sent me an email to say that she got caught up in something, because I think Joan's been in the group for 2 years, and I've never seen her as animated about anything as this particular one, so I'm sorry that she had to miss it finally. But she said something interesting, which many of us have maybe felt with Philip Roth's work, because it's situated in New Jersey, and she grew up in or around Patterson, and this was all very familiar to her. And somebody had also said, I think it was you who had said, that you come from a Polish background, and there was familiarity here. There was familiarity for me, and then I remember thinking back to my grandparents, who were probably of the same generation, and my grandfather was a tailor. They tailored in their home, and there was fabric, and it was in Brooklyn, it was in Coney Island, it wasn't in Patterson, but for many of us there was a familiarity, I think. Certainly the Jews and the Eastern Europeans among us, there was a cultural familiarity. So the reading was rich.